And we're back. Peace and love, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the STEM Files, Marine Biology in your community. On tonight's episode, we chat with Tanasia Swift on her work teaching young people about marine life in their community. Tune in for more of this dynamic episode after this. All right, like that again, family. Welcome, welcome, welcome back to the STEM Files, the voice of STEM talent in Black culture, where we highlight the best and brightest in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I am your humble co-host and moderator for this evening, Jabril Muhammad, aka Jabrilian Engineer. I am a civilian mechanical engineer focusing on naval ship fluid systems with a background in materials science and engineering. I am typically joined by my illustrious co-host, Tariq Muhammad, aka Tariq Cardiac, a biomedical research scientist uh, focusing on the study of how diseases form in the heart and other blood vessels. But, family, as we always say, this show is not about us, the host, but who we bring on as the guest to give us great insights into all things STEM. So, without further ado, I want to introduce to some and present to all Tanasia Swift. How you doing?
Hello. Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Yes, definitely exciting. And I love to do that with the intros and everything. So, family, again, as we're continuing, this is the STEM Files. Your brilliant engineer, Tariq Cardiac. Make sure to follow us and tune in to Voice STEM Talent in Black Culture every Thursday and Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're live via Facebook at the STEM Files, YouTube, the STEM Files, and follow us on Instagram for updates at the STEM Files as well. So, Tanasia, why don't you get us started? Tell us a little bit about yourself. We want us to hear, and we're going to get right into the nitty gritty, okay?
Sounds good. So I don't know if I can do a better introduction than you did, but my name is Tanasia Swift, born and raised still here in Brooklyn, New York. So I'm native to New York City. My background is in marine science and conservation. So, growing up in Brooklyn, of course, you don't necessarily think or connect the two, marine science with the city. But I was so lucky to essentially, or fortunate rather, to be able to be on this path. So right now I do work for a nonprofit doing not only marine science, but community building, community outreach, community science, some call it citizen science work. And a lot of my job is basically getting young people, getting the communities around New York City to the water, teaching them about the ecosystem. And that was essentially something that was ingrained in me through my dad being near the water, going crabbing, going fishing. So it's great to be able to give back and share my knowledge and the work that I do now.
Awesome, awesome. You mentioned so much stuff, fishing, trapping. It's so crazy that Tariq isn't on the show. And family, just so you know, like I said, I'm typically joined by my co-host Tariq, but he is actually handling some important business on behalf of Original Man Scientific and the STEM File. So, and some other things. So he's out, doing big things, and we're going to be talking about that on the back end soon. So, it's funny because Tariq's originally from Harlem, and every
No?
time we have somebody that's from New York, I always mess with him because the majority of his life has not been like, well, at least my understanding hasn't been in New York. But I could have had that wrong. But I always give him a hard time. Like, bro, you like, how long would you living in New York? But anyway, I'm from Philly. I've been in Philly my whole life. I'm born and raised my whole life. And I'm saying you going to claim New York, but it's okay. It's okay. But getting back to what we were discussing, so you talked about some of your work you've done with water, right? You talked about fishing, you talked about trapping. You used the term ecosystem. What I really want to get into is just really understanding, for our audience, what really is marine biology, environmental science, right? And why is that important for people to know and understand as it pertains to their surroundings, and potentially as people who may be interested in going to something related to ocean sciences in the future?
Right, great question. So essentially with marine biology or marine sciences, it's the study of the marine world. And not only just the animals and living things that are in the ocean, in our waterways, but also the non-living things as well. So, looking at water chemistry, looking at hydrodynamics, how the water moves, looking at, of course, plants which are living, but essentially you're looking at how all of these components interact with one another. And I think most people automatically think of, oh, you're just studying animals, right? And
Right.
that's a misconception when it comes to, marine science and marine biology. And the reason why it's important is partially because, as I mentioned in the definition, about how everything is connected. We live on this earth, right? We live on this earth. We can essentially name some of the places that we go within our local community. But what about some of the things that are not so local? So like waterways, right? And there's going to be a time when, nature is going to essentially take its course. Like you can't not interact with nature. We're in nature every day. So I think it's important that folks have that knowledge or at least experience, get their feet wet, no pun intended, and essentially learn about the place that they're living. Not only on a local scale, but more so sort of like widespread. And so we can go into it all day. Like I speak about New York City in particular. People forget that New York City is a coastal city. Like we're surrounded by water. We're literally on an island. And I think for some, when Sandy, which was that big storm that came through in 2013, it was sort of like a wide awakening, right? You hear about climate change, you hear about sea level rise, but it's never an issue until that water is in your basement, that water is in your backyard. And then it's sort of like, wow, I really have to, understand what's happening here when it comes to climate change, when it comes to ocean science. And so I think bridging the two and, spreading the word about marine science is important, not only for now, but for the long term. We need more people, on board with that.
Absolutely. You know what? The earth is 70% water. Your body similarly 70% water.
Right.
Water is in the air, water is in your sweat, water is in your blood. We drink water, we consume water in our foods, right? The concept of water comes into place with climate. When we think about how hard it is to breathe in a dry climate, like dry heat versus humid climate. I've been to Vegas, I've been to Africa, right? Ghana specifically. It was hot in both places, right? I felt like in Ghana the sun was on my neck. However, the ability for me to sweat and sweat profusely dang near saved my life. However, in Las Vegas, I felt like my body was on fire because of the lack of humidity, right? So water comes into play in so many ways. And then again, going back to that concept of ecosystem, right? You have to understand the world as a system. Like you said, everything's connected. We had Maynard Okereke, the hip hop MD, on it with us last week talking about intersectionality.
Yeah.
And how you as a authentic individual, there's so many aspects to yourself. Similarly, there's so many aspects to water, marine biology, environmental science that needs to be shared with the world, right? So let's get into, I guess, more about your background. Talk about, like, if I'm trying to pursue, right, marine biology, I'm trying to get into those ocean specific, water specific, career paths, if you will. What are some subjects that I should look to be good at? What are some classes I should be ready and willing to take? And how should I orient my mind to prepare myself for that type of focus and career development?
Right. So I can talk a little bit about my career path and then go into sort of like what others can do to essentially get into it. So for me, as I mentioned, I grew up in Brooklyn, specifically in Bed-Stuy, which is mostly central Brooklyn, very landlocked, not necessarily next to the water. And my initial interactions with the harbor and with water came from two places. As I mentioned, my dad being sort of like a crabber, me being a daddy's girl, wherever he goes, I'm right there behind him, right? And so having that one-on-one interaction with the water, not necessarily anything at that moment like science based. She wasn't necessarily thinking science. She's just thinking fun, when you're a little kid, right?
Right.
And then so having those experiences, but then also really seeing all of these television shows and seeing all of these oceans and all of the things that you can do as a marine scientist, sharks, all of that essentially sparked my interest. And so from there, I started to do my own research. And I'm talking, when I was very young, doing your own research, understanding what it is that you want to do. So I think that first step would be understanding what it is that you want to do. Like what's your interest? Secondly, I was fortunate in New York City. There is a public high school, the New York Harbor School. At that time, when I was going into high school, in New York City, they give you this big book of high schools that you can apply to. And during that time, it was the first year that school was actually, or the second year rather, that school was running. So I went to this maritime high school where students are learning about, scuba diving. You're learning about how to drive boats. You're learning about marine biology, marine research, doing all of these different aspects of marine science. So I was fortunate enough to be able to start that path very early on. So in high school. And then after high school, I went on to study environmental studies in college. So I went to school in Long Island, SUNY Stony Brook University. Ended up getting my bachelor's degree in environmental studies. And then from there, it was sort of like volunteering, figuring out what my path was. Because with this degree, you can essentially go in so many different ways. And so
Right.
for me, it was, not only volunteering in my local neighborhood and figuring out what those careers might be in New York City, because for the longest, I thought I wouldn't even be able to do this work in the city.
Mm.
So I would say for those who are interested, and I always say my story is not done yet. My story is far
Right.
from complete. It's still beginning. So for those who are interested in doing it, I would say try a little bit of everything, right? I think students have there's this pressure to figure out what you want to do, figure out what you want to be very early on. And for parents, not only students, but let your child experience things, give them that moment to experience different fields, different activities, different, things that they want to do. Try them out. And if you see that it's for you, then I would definitely say look into programs that are local to your neighborhood or your school or your college, wherever you are in your educational career, and find a mentor. So find that
Yes.
person who is
Yes.
going to help you and guide you through that process. And for me, it was sort of like one of the things that I can imagine other students probably will have to go through is finding someone who you can connect with, who understands your passion, and making sure that you make it be known that I'm not going anywhere, going to
Right.
those office hours, making sure that you apply for any scholarships that you can, and essentially just just try it out. And if it's your passion, it will essentially happen.
Mm. Listen, since you about to pull a sermon about your boy, you start talking about the babies. Now, because I want to say something. So I want to take a step back. So, Brother Tariq and
Mhm.
I are members of the Nation of Islam, and
Right,
in our supreme wisdom lessons, one of the lessons we're given the area of the water on the planet Earth,
right.
139,685,000 square miles. Now,
Mhm.
similar to the vastness of this planet Earth, that is water, is the vastness of experiences that your children can
Mhm.
have if you allow them to do so. Why is that important? I hear people say, parents, people, oh, I'm gonna just let my child kind of just figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to be. I've said this more than once on this show. If you're not giving your children something or stimulating them in a certain way, society's doing it. There's no
Right,
such thing as anyone who operates in a vacuum. Yes, you can be a free thinker, but your freedom is still is underneath an overarching system of things. You don't
Mm-hmm.
operate as the sole person in a certain sphere of reality, right? So
Right. Right.
whose fault is it when a child grows up and all they've been to is their hometown,
Right.
right? Now we understand things happen financially and everything, but to give your child experiences and to understand and focus on and as a parent or guardian, look to heighten their interest in things that they're skilled in,
Mm-hmm.
right? Know what
Right.
your child likes to do, know what they're good at, right? And then start to move them in these ways so that as they get older, they do know what they want to do. I am not of the mindset you have to have everything figured out. I am of the mindset that a lot of our babies would know if they were given the chance.
Right.
So that is something that's, me and Tariq were both homeschooled for almost a decade,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the reason why I'm so in love with homeschooling, particularly in this time for Black children in particular, is because a lot of our, you know, gripes, issues, and concerns get swept under the rug in the school system. But who loves
Yeah.
you more than the person who is spending every day with you, whether they be parent or astute teacher giving you that specific time? You can take your time with things, right? Or you can
Mm-hmm.
accelerate if need be, right? So I just wanted to pull that out very quickly because you said something, talking about those your children, right, and making sure that they're well versed in different things.
Right.
Um,
Right. Not to cut you
what?
off. Also,
Yeah, go
you
ahead.
mentioned
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
because you mentioned the Nation of Islam. So my dad, I grew up in basically a 5% household, right? And
Okay.
so
Okay.
learning lessons and understanding, like the not only the biology of the earth, so those things were. And my dad, I always say, my dad was the first scientist I ever met, right?
Right.
Not only because he was a fisherman, but like growing up in the nation of gods and earth or 5% nation, you would hear essentially, my dad and the other gods having conversations about, what's this lesson or what's that lesson and how it relates to the earth and who's a scientist. And essentially you're picking those things up as you go along. And as you're young and you're in the circles and you're essentially absorbing that information. So yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Peace to the gods, peace to the nation of gods and earth, the 5% nation, our brothers, our sisters, or lords and earth, right? Praise be to Allah. That's dope because what you really start to understand as you go into the lessons, as you go into these things, and you study yourself, you study surroundings, is that science is in everything,
Right.
right? And what science or STEM should invoke in the person who gives themselves over to the study is humility. If you're not growing in humility as you're learning, then you you got to start over. You need to self-assess because
Right.
engaging in science or studying science lets you know that you now have learned something, but there's so much more, right, in this world to know and to understand, right?
Right.
Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, says, "Seek knowledge from cradle to grave." And
Mm-hmm.
paraphrasing, he talked about to come back from the journey of knowledge is really death, right? So you should always be seeking knowledge, not to get pig-headed or big-headed, but to grow in humility and be of service to your fellow man, which I want to get into something with you. We talk about marine biology in your community, right? Let's talk about the filter and removing the filter from education, right? I believe that there's education in their schooling or education in traditional schooling. Now,
Yep.
you can be educated in school, but they're not necessarily synonymous. So, can you talk about the importance of your work in that you remove that filter when it comes to exposing young people to marine biology in your community?
Right. So you've already sort of like touched on it. So I am not a formal teacher in the classroom. I am an educator, but not a formal teacher where you'd see someone in the classroom with the students every day. Right. And so a part of my work is, of course, it's STEM related, bringing students to the waterway, bringing them out to New York City, seeing, essentially using the outdoors, using the water, using basins as their classroom. Very hands-on. Is very inquiry based, and I think with classroom settings, students can be limited to some degree, depending on the school and the type of school it is. students can't be expected to sit down in a chair all day, absorb information, be lectured, and then expect to pass tests, right? I don't think that method necessarily works. So if you have students who have very different ways of learning, and even adults, right? And putting them in different situations where they can learn is very hands-on. It's not necessarily just like getting a lecture or reading through a textbook to obtain information. Is going out and trying it out yourself, which is the basis of STEM, right? So going out, trying something out, seeing how it works, learning these new concepts by hands-on education. And so I think that's extremely important because, like we know, so many students, they haven't been able to find what it is that they're great at because, textbook learning does not work for them, right? I've been in so many situations where we go out to a field site, to a waterway around New York City, and the student that is quote unquote troublesome or has attention issues, you give them a role, right? Your role is to essentially make sure these fish don't die or whatever it may be, right? You give them a responsibility. And you just automatically see this switch in them. You automatically see this sort of like pride that they have that now I have something I can do. I have a skill that I can do. Or another example, you give a student the responsibility of taking the water quality measurements for that day, right? So not only are they given responsibility, but they're learning a skill, whether they know it or not, whether it be a small skill that they've just learned or something they've been doing for a while. And so when students are learning hands-on, it expands the way that they can think, and it also can increase their confidence in the things that they're doing, right? They're learning a skill. They know how to do it. And I think that's extremely important, partially just because of the way, we learn. When you learn something, you're doing it every day. Like, for example, you are, as you grow up, you learn how to button your sweater, right? And these skills that students are doing out in the field, when they come out with me or one of my colleagues, is basically this repetition, it's inquiry based, and so many other questions will arise from just that experience. So it's one of the things that I think is really important in childhood development, and just getting them comfortable outdoors and in the water, and with skills.
Ooh, that was a word. I'm gonna say something to these audience members. I see y'all dropping black fists and black hearts and good questions and assalamu alaikum family, but I'm gonna need y'all to drop some inquiries, some questions. You know what I'm saying? I'm gonna make sure that we are diving in because sis is giving us a super amount of gems. So if you do have any questions or comments, please drop them in the chat. I will make sure that they get asked to our wonderful guest, and that we are able to dive deeper into what she has expertise in. You said, I thought about collegiate education, right, college, and this school system, and we're really dealing with a very jaded, antiquated system, right?
Mm-hmm.
You think about summer vacation, right? If you look back at the history of America, my understanding is the reason why we had like 3 or so months is because around that time when things were started, a lot of the children were going to help with the farm. Ain't nobody doing that today. Well, if you are, it's a select few. So why do we have so much time off? And then what you find is going into the next grade, children have forgotten so much if they weren't doing review. And a lot of us, if we bear witness and we true, them summer projects we did with them last few weeks before school started. So, and I'm guilty of it as well, right? So we have to understand that we're dealing with a very modern and technologically savvy child, young person, where skill and value and being able to add value, that terminology, right? Being a thought leader, that's what's sexy now, right? Big data, blockchain, right? Social media, Bitcoin, right? AI, all these things are shaping the world as we know it from a STEM perspective. But are we equipping, today's mechanical engineering degree cannot be your grandfather's mechanical engineering degree. Right. Today's civil engineering degree cannot be your grandmother's civil engineering degree. And no disrespect to them, they're the foundation for which we stand on. But to go further, we have to be now innovative and understand how do we tool this new generation of students and then professionals to add value to society and move it forward. And I think that's exactly what you're doing. Now, we got to get into the science, right? Billion Oyster Project. Now, I'm not. I work I work as a civilian engineer for the Navy, but I am not astute when it comes to marine biology and marine science. So, talk to us about oysters. Why oysters? Why are they so important to the ecosystem? What do they give us? What do they take from us? Like they're kind of ugly. So why should we care about them?
I know, right? It's so oysters essentially they have a long-standing history in New York City, actually around the world. You know, when you think about it. But essentially, a part of learning about the oysters, you have to also learn about the history of, you know, what happened. You know, like you have this concept called shifting baselines. So basically, looking at the baseline or the starting point for what something was or what a population might have been might be very different for one generation than generations 20 years down the line, right? So when it comes to oysters in New York City, they have played a large role in our ecosystem. So everyone, you know, oysters is a food. People eat oysters all the time. But you don't necessarily think about the ecosystem benefits and what they do for our environment, right? So oysters are filter feeders. They're shellfish.
Yes.
So essentially, they pull in, they pull in harbor water, and they take out sort of like the algae and things that are suspended in the water column, and they create cleaner or clearer waters, right? So when you have more oysters in the body of water, it essentially will aid in filtering and cleaning that body of water. Oyster reefs themselves, I also compare them to like the coral reefs of the Caribbean. So if you have more reefs, you have more fish, you have more biodiversity. And fish, of course, use reefs for not only habitat, for hiding, they use them to find food. So you have an increase in biodiversity, an increase in water quality. And then if a reef is large enough, you also have protection of the shorelines, just like marshes and estuaries. So all of these ecosystems or smaller ecosystems are benefiting our marine habitat, not only in water, but on land as well. And the reason why we are now studying oysters and the reason why we're trying to replenish them in New York City is because New York City has once had, you know, over 200,000 acres of oysters, right? And if anyone is from New York City, that's about the size of, I want to say, like 7 Staten Islands. So large acres of oyster reefs all around the harbor. And even, you know, and at one point, so the indigenous group that was here before, you know, colonization, the Lenape, they were here harvesting oysters. They were here essentially understanding the biology of oysters, right? But then, of course, with time, the British, the Dutch started to move in. We started to industrialize New York City. So digging up the harbor so that bigger boats can get through, which essentially starts to destroy habitat. Of course, with people, you know, the increase in population in New York City starting to have an impact on the pollution in the harbor, because at that time, we didn't have the proper infrastructure to treat waste. So all of our waste goes into the harbor. Now you have polluted waterways, people getting sick from living near the waterways. And then you also have overharvesting, basically taking more oysters out of the water than they can actually replenish. So you went from this baseline, going back to that idea of shifting baselines. So you went from this baseline of having large oysters to, with time, the size of that oyster just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where not only is the size decreasing, but the populations around New York has been also decreasing as well. And when that happens, you don't have the same ecosystem benefits that they once had when there were a lot of oysters in the water. So they're not filtering as much. They're not being able to protect the shorelines as much. And of course, because of, you know, green or gray infrastructure, so putting concrete on a location that was supposed to be wetlands. So all of that comes into play. And they're not being able to provide biodiversity. So what we're trying to do is install these reefs around the city, not only for those ecosystem benefits, but for students and community scientists and the community to be a part of that process as well. You know, because when you think about the people who go into these fields, Like I know so many people, some of my colleagues that I went to college with, it was like, yeah, I used to grow up on boats somewhere in the Hamptons, or yeah, my dad owned a boat, or I used to go fishing. And it's not the story here in New York City. It's very uncommon for someone to say, yeah, I was a part of this marine science program and we grew up growing oysters in New York City. So what we're trying to do is make that experience on the water for students something that almost every student can say, yes, I've experienced. And then with time, so right now we're trying to restore oysters for those ecosystem benefits. So we're not thinking about eating them. We're not thinking about harvesting them. That'll probably be years down the line. But even now, the harbor has been the cleanest that it's been in over 100 years. So you're having whales in New York City. You're having dolphin swimming in the East River, just like the other day, like 2 days ago, there was a pod of dolphins swimming close to shore. Folks are standing from the beach and you can see humpback whales just like breaching out of the water. So once again, going back to that term of shifting the baseline. When I was growing up, I didn't see any whales in New York City. I didn't see dolphins in New York City. And now the next generations will be able to say, not only have I had a hand in restoring my ecosystem in my harbor, the place that's in my backyard, but yeah, I grew up seeing dolphins in New York City. Yes, I grew up seeing whales in New York City. And it just goes to show how much, urban areas can progress. So I know I went on a tangent there, but it's it makes me excited. It makes me excited thinking about all those things.
Absolutely. And thank you. That was great teaching. You just blessed us with a whole marine sermon on oysters. I just want to say shout out to the audience because I asked and I received. It's like 12 questions in the chat. So I just want to say y'all are killing it right now. Snaps to y'all. Snaps to y'all. Throw some blackfish in the chat for me, and we're gonna keep this rocking. So I'm gonna make sure I get through as many of these questions as possible in this last 30 minutes. For any of my Avatar: The Last Airbender fans, what she really talking about is we got to restore balance, family. We got to restore balance, right? When you overfish and the Quran talks about exceeding the limits, right? When you just, as humanity, throughout time is lived a life of exceeding the limits, doing this too much, and cutting down too many trees and killing too many of these animals, doing things for fun as opposed to for necessity. You get things where now, we got to get back to that circle of life. The great prophet Mufasa said, shoot, he said, when we die, we become the grass. What? And the antelope eat the grass, right? Right? See, y'all thought y'all was smart.
That's right.
Right? We thought we were smarter than Mufasa. Come on, man. So we're going to get into some of these questions. We have Nadia Stevens. She says, are there any volunteer opportunities for those who are interested to help with marine biology and the cleaning of our waterways? I know you talked about the billion oyster project. Is there anything else that you know of in or outside of New York?
Yeah, so definitely there are. So we do have volunteer opportunities that you can do with us. So our main base is on Governor's Island for those who are in New York City. So that's where our hatchery is. That's where our essentially main base is. We have this shell collection program, and there's a lot that can go into that. But if you are interested in volunteering, you can either volunteer on Governor's Island to help out, with creating our structures. We also have field opportunities, which is the program that I run. So getting people out into the water, putting on those waders, which are essentially these big waterproof overalls, helping us to collect data. We also have a citizen science project or program. We call it community science, but citizen is the more, I guess, universal term. But a community science program where people can be trained, like say if you want to do something long-term, you want to help collect data, you want to help us in the field by looking for those wild oyster populations around the city. So there are a few different routes that you can go in helping the Billion Oyster Project and volunteering. There are some organizations that also do, like New York City Parks is a big one. They have a restoration, program where people can help restore some of the beach grass and also help planting the beach grass. And for example, they also have a horseshoe crab monitoring program. So all of these programs you can do right here in New York City. You could probably check them out and see if you're, able to join. Nadia, you can, reach out to me specifically. I know Nadia. Hey, Nadia, thanks for chiming in. if you're interested
Oh,
in
that's the
helping.
homie. Okay, okay, Nadia. Come on, homie. That's what I'm talking about. Represent. Yes, ma'am. Awesome, awesome. And like you said, we'll be sharing more of Tanasia's information a bit later for those who are not close friends and want to tap in with her more. We have a question from Wade the Fourth. He said, "Would you be able to give suggestions on how to set up a pilot feasibility study on oyster restoration in Raritan Bay?" Am I saying that right?
Yep.
Raritan Bay.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So great question. So one of the ways so it's sort of like a process, right? So in order to get a pilot study going, you essentially want to understand what's there now. So looking at whether it's, taking water quality testing. I'm not sure if you have any sort of like water quality testing kits, but looking at the quality of water that's currently there. One of the things that we also do when we're setting up a pilot study is looking if there are wild populations of oysters. There's an entire protocol that I can go into on a separate time, but looking to see if there are any wild oysters around Raritan Bay and seeing where they are, how big they are, collecting that data. And one of the things that we do is we can train people on how to do this, but you're essentially looking for those areas that so oysters, they grow on hard surfaces. So like rocks or piers or pilings. So not necessarily sandy areas or beachy areas. They want to have something to attach to. So looking at or trying to see if you can find some wild oysters, collecting that data, looking at the water quality or taking sort of like a snapshot of the water quality before you get oysters in the water. And then also we also give, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but we also give these cages called oyster research stations. And essentially they are cages. We give you oysters, you place them into your local waterway, and you're seeing on a very small scale how those oysters will survive. So you're looking at what time, month by month, if the oysters are growing, if they're dying off, observing what they're doing. And then from there, that data can help us determine how a much larger reef or an installation will do. So looking at all of those components.
Thank you so much for breaking that down because I had no idea, as you probably know. And I hope Wade the Fourth, I hope that you definitely was well fed with that answer. And like you said, she will definitely be available in the future if you want to tap in. We'll be sharing her information at a later time. My brother Chaz X, Assalamu alaikum, he says, "What simple activities can we introduce to our children in order to introduce them to the marine sciences in general? Something parents who are not skilled in that area can probably introduce to our children 10 years old and younger."
Right. So marine science is such a huge field, right? So in the beginning, we spoke about the living things and the non-living things. So depending on, so you said 10 and old or younger rather. So depending on, in 10 and younger, there's a wide range of things, right? So one of the things that you can do is one, take your, students out to, or your child out to the local waterway, right? So if you are someone who's not a fisherman or really knows too much about organisms, one of the things that I really encourage, and it can be as simple as walking along the shorelines, depending on where you are, there's these things called tidal pools. And they're super fun. So essentially when the tide goes out, there are these pools or small like inlets of water where fish can essentially sometimes be left in them. You can examine that. So, trying that out as a first introductory activity. There's things that you can do at home as well to introduce students to the idea of water chemistry. So for example, lots of, fish stores, they have water quality testing kits, right? So if you're interested in something like chemistry, so say if your 10-year-old is really interested in chemistry, you can do some water quality testing with your tap water, looking at maybe if you want to see how, to create salty water or looking at solutions. There's a bunch of activities that you can do with water chemistry just from the water in your home, a simple kit from the fish store, or if you have a fish tank, looking at that. You can also look at, there are a bunch of virtual videos that, I forget, there's a website you can look at sort of like aquariums and fish as it's in person or in live time. That's another activity that you can do, mostly geared towards younger students. Looking at fish anatomy, which is a fun one. So incorporating some art into, learning about fish. So learning about the parts of a fish and helping students design their own fish and looking at what they're useful for. It's a wide variety of activities that, can be done. Like I normally have these little trinkets and little figurines of fish and different animals. And so when I have my nieces or things come over, we talk about what each of these animals do, where they can be found. Books, of course, is a huge one. So if your child is a huge reader, recommending different books. So I would say just meet your child where they are, whatever their interests are, and go from there.
Mm, absolutely. If I may add, this is related but slightly different. So, we're talking about marine biology, talking about things that live in water. One of the things that I found, as with my background in material science, was how cool it was to observe the properties of non-Newtonian fluids. So
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by that is, a fluid that does not act as your normal fluids do, like your water and other things. So, for example, there's something called oobleck that you make with kind of like a cleaning type bleach detergent, and you add it in parts of water and other things. And what tends to occur is, depending on the rate at which you interact with the surface, it will act as either a liquid or a solid. And one of the things
Mm-hmm.
that can be done is you can create a large vat or path, and you can literally have children. Now, you don't want to do this in your house if you have a love affair with your floors, okay? You want to go somewhere where you can, it's a nice hard surface, you can clean it up afterwards, but you can set up a path, have your children run across it. Again, this isn't so much marine biology, but it's still
Mm-hmm.
understanding fluids, and that there's several different types of fluids in life, and how you can have normal or more traditional Newtonian fluids such as water and
Mm-hmm.
non-Newtonian fluids such as what I was describing. So that was definitely, thank you so much for sharing what you shared, and it just got me
Yeah.
like kind of like excited, like I want to do some of this stuff myself.
Yeah, that also
um,
reminds me, before you go to the next question, another activity is looking
mhm,
at water density, so
right.
how, colder water is more dense than warmer water. So an activity that you can do is essentially take cold water, you can put a little food coloring or food dye in it, take some warm water, also color it with food, making sure that the colors are very different, and then slowly pour the cold water into that warm water solution, and then seeing,
Mm,
what happens with the water. If the colder water is on top, if it's, so observing the properties of water. There's small experiments that you can do with even currents, or just, in currents in a jar. So many activities that, like I can go on and on and on with particular activities. But yeah, so many things that you can sort of like do as an introductory to marine science. Another
absolutely.
activity. Oh,
And
sorry.
go
I'm
ahead.
going in now.
No,
I'm
no, no,
going
go
in.
ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
The
This is
big
good.
activity that I love to do is also, so I spoke about, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this one. Looking at, we didn't speak too much about ocean acidification. So the fact that, like the oceans are becoming more acidic, and things like coral reefs and oyster shells, which are made out of calcium carbonate, they can't withstand acidic waters. So if you have coral reefs in the Caribbean, the water is becoming more acidic because of global warming. That's an entire topic we can go on about. Those skeleton of the coral and the shells of the oysters will essentially start to weaken. So an experiment that you can do with students is, if you have a shell, you can find a shell at the beach. If you, like have a shell in your house, and then try to put different solutions that have on different pH scales. So looking at lemon juice, lime juice, what's another one, like tomato sauce, regular water. So taking different solutions, taking various shells, putting them inside of those solutions, and watching what happens over time. So seeing
Mm,
in the more acidic solution, you can look online for like a pH scale, and they give examples. There's like milk that's on there as well. And seeing what happens to that shell with time. And that will essentially give us an idea as far as how things that are made out of calcium carbonate act in more acidic environments. So that's another cool experiment that, like you can do with your student that talks about ocean or introduces ocean acidification.
Absolutely. That's dope. Thank you so much for sharing. At this time, family, we're going to do something pretty dope. We're going to shift the roles a little bit, shift the table. So recently, we've been allowing for our guests to play interviewer and us as the host play interviewee. Again, interviewee. Say that 3 times fast, but you can't. All right. So with that, I'm going to allow you, Tanasia, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask myself related to the STEM files, Original Man Scientific, my personal journey in STEM, etc. The floor is yours.
Right. Okay. Awesome. I feel special now. So I know with Original Man Scientific, essentially there's a component where you're actually helping people develop science projects. Is that correct? Or is that accurate to say?
So more formally, it is a component where we are helping people develop their ideas, bring them to
Mm-hmm.
life. So it's a research and development component where you have an idea, you can get it down on paper, you can get it developed in CAD if it is something physical, right? A prototype manufacturing, and hopefully bring it to market and have your intellectual property protected as well.
Right. Okay. So, and with that, so before someone were to, like, say if there is someone who is really interested in bringing their design to life, and before they reach out to you, is there anything that you would recommend? Because once when we had a conversation like months ago, like last year, and I said, like, that's an amazing idea. What is there anything that they should have prepared before bringing their designs or bringing their ideas to you before having it sort of like, going through the process, or what prerequisites should people be prepared with in terms of working with Original Man Scientific?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question. So whenever we work with anyone, they find us on social media or whatever, they come to us, one of the first things we have them do is fill out a questionnaire. It has a series of questions about their invention. What is it? How does it function? Give us some basic specs that you would like to have included, you know, and a number of other questions, right? But it's pretty comprehensive for us to get a nice look into what this will look like, what it's for, how you want it to function, who it's for, the market, etc. In addition to this questionnaire, or even before filling out this questionnaire, I would highly recommend, we always highly recommend people research the market. Does something like this exist, right?
Mm-hmm,
How
mm-hmm.
does it work? Is what you have, is it new? Is it novel? Because when you talk about patenting something physically, it has to be new, not novel, non-obvious, right? It
Mm-hmm.
could be a actual product, it could be a process, etc. These are the types of questions you want to ask yourself. Also, you want to look at the cost of similar products. A lot of times we may deal with people, and it's okay, but sometimes people don't have a understanding of how much things can cost. Like, for example, we work in assist with people with app development. That is not a cheap process, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have different types of apps which will cost you different amounts, but you're not really going to get a comprehensive app for a few $100s. Also, it's
Right.
not going to be a quick process, right? This is going to be an iterative process where you're going to be, as it's developed, providing feedback, and then we're going to keep doing it, right? So have some understanding of the market, right? Is this a real need? Is this a niche market, right? Whereas though, like, are you fulfilling a specific need, right? And then be willing to definitely hear the other side, the expertise, and
Mm-hmm.
know that we're going to be ready to work with you. So I would say, do research on budget, do research on if this already exists or something similar, right? Um, and just have a great write things down and like be able to reference your notes for when you fill out the questionnaire.
Nice, nice, awesome. I do have another question, being that we're in the sort of like the maritime world and you being a naval engineer. So in terms of marine science, is there any marine science, or in what components is marine science incorporated into your career field?
That's a great question. So a lot, right? So I'm a civilian engineer for the U.S. Navy, right? So I work specifically with the destroyer class ships. And I will speak very carefully, as some of the things I work on require certain clearance, right? So, but everybody knows that there's several different ship classes in any navy, right? And as you know, ships travel in water.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about the interaction with water, you have different sea states that affect your ship's ability to move at a certain rate and move swiftly. You have the concept of, or the threat of, barnacles, right? So when barnacles attach to the hull of a ship, that creates drag, and that also can create noise and allow you to be detected by an enemy ship.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so there was something developed actually some time ago. There was a new paint, and this is material science. It was lit. So the paint that you see, that grayish paint, is anti-barnacle paint. Whereas though it
Mm-hmm.
disallows for barnacles at the same rate at which they were adhering before to adhere to the whole surface, with these current ships and things like that. So there's a number of different ways, marine life, interact. Also, from a stealth perspective, when you just talk about, I guess, being one with your environment, when you think about ships, there's a reason
Mm-hmm.
why they're that color. If you look down or look from a distance, it can be difficult to see them. That
Mm-hmm.
grayish color tends to blend in
Yes.
to some degree with the surface of the ship. So the more healthy the marriage between maritime technology and the actual maritime environment, the more successful you will be in anything you do, whether it's in defense or otherwise. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I was also mentioning because with the New York Harbor School, the high school that I was mentioning earlier, it is a maritime high school. So students, it's you can think of it as sort of like a trade school, but we call it career and technical education. So students are receiving a trade in a maritime field, whether it be professional scuba diving, whether it be vessel operation, so how to operate, drive a boat, navigate a boat, whether it be how to do marine science. And so students, after they graduate from this high school, they're essentially looking at different career paths and fields that they can do in the maritime world. And it's always sort of like, once again, being in New York City, it's sort of like they've had that experience. But now after you graduate, you've gained this skill, or whether you go on to continue your education, I think those students are always wondering what types of jobs they can do in the marine world, and not only just like marine science, but whether it's a naval engineer, right? So I think that's a great example of like a career path that a student might be interested in. So definitely.
I got to speak to that. I got to speak to that because that's a great question. You know, naval engineering, it tends to be a less sexy, field because ships are old, right? It's not AI. It's not this and the third. So what we have to understand about a ship, and this is like in general, naval ships are small cities. A navy ship has
Mm-hmm.
to
Right.
have everything that a sailor needs to survive, or that they interact with generally on their everyday lives on board. Things like gyms, right? Right. Your mess hall, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your little worship services, place for healing, right? Little doctor's office,
Mm-hmm.
mail, right? And then you obviously have your various machinery spaces and everything for different systems aboard ship, right? So you have everything needed on in terms of like naval engineering, or engineering related to ships, right? You have your mechanical engineering, you have your various systems, computer-based systems, you have steam systems, compressed
Mm-hmm.
air systems, sonar systems, different communication systems. You have material science. So I talk about things for the whole. We talk about corrosion.
Mm-hmm.
listen, listen, listen. Before doing work in the more of the mechanical engineering side, I did material failure analysis and
Mm-hmm.
structural engineering, right? And one thing you have to understand, all materials, believe it or not, whether you see it, they're all slowly but surely returning to their original state. They are
Right.
splitting into their constituent elements, right? So when you walk around and you see that, we call it oxidization or rust,
Right.
that's
Right.
what's
Yeah,
happening.
resting.
Rust is the returning back to your original state.
Right.
And that occurs on metallic surfaces. You have to understand that. So I'm telling you, if you're in STEM, there's a place for you. STEM, business, accounting, all that is wrapped
Mhm.
into ship science and naval sciences. So I hope that answered that question even more.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I'm a huge I mean, I'm not necessarily a big boater, but definitely being on boats and ships, it's definitely, as you mentioned, like a huge city. I've never, well, there is a like a big naval ship in New York City, but it's essentially stationary, and those things are huge, right? Like I literally got lost in one doing a little tour at one point. They're just absolutely huge. So I can only imagine what it is, like just living on one for even like a week or so. So that's pretty cool.
Listen, I've been on a few different surface ships. I've never been on a submarine. I don't know how to do it, but
Hmm.
so one of the things when you have engineering, right? It's with ships you have a specific uh, area, right? Which you have to fit a bunch of things in. So as you can probably infer, for us taller folks, I have to work on not getting scoliosis sometimes. I got to walk like this sometimes, and then don't let me put a hard head on. I put a hard head on 6'5". You know, so
Right.
it tends to be difficult sometimes moving around, but it's a great experience, and you do interact with a lot of different types of technology. So, yeah. Do you have anything else you would like to ask?
I think those are all great questions. Yeah, so definitely appreciate the work that you do. Is super interesting. So yeah, yeah.
And same to you. So with that, family, as we are closing out, how what is one last nugget or two that you would like for the audience to get from this interview? If they didn't learn anything, you hope they learned X, or just one takeaway you'd like for them to have.
Right. So many different takeaways. For the most part, I would say we didn't, you mentioned intersectionalism, about one of the previous interviews, and why people shouldn't care about the oceans and the environment. And the one nugget that I would say is, when it comes to how we preserve our earth, how we preserve our land, how we preserve, nature, the things that's surrounding us. Um, One of the biggest things that I really appreciate about the natural world is the ability for it to be sort of like this mentally stimulating or mentally calming atmosphere, right? Especially in big cities, you're hustling and bustling, you're moving around, trying to get to work on the subway, stressed out. And when you there's been plenty of studies that talk about how the oceans and how green spaces help with our, mental abilities, right? Whether it be reducing stress, whether it be making you feel more comfortable and calm. Um, so even if you're not, the bigger swimmer, or if you're not like interested in becoming a marine scientist, definitely spend some time with yourself, with your children, with your family, near water. It might be the medicine that we need instead of going to,
Come on.
artificial medicines. So definitely take some time to spend time in nature. That's what I would say. It does things for the body. It does things for healing, and salt water in itself, can heal the body in so many different ways. So spend time in nature. That would be my gem. Spend time in nature, and you
Spend
never know how
time in
that
nature.
will transcend into your life in other ways. So
Listen, you about to pull a whole nother sermon out of me. Y'all know Big Mama talked to y'all about sitting in that Epsom salt. Come on
right,
now. Y'all come on. Y'all know Big Mama that hit y'all with that Epsom salt. You woke up next day feeling like a new man, right?
right, right,
And especially like you said with COVID, right? And this pandemic, we are realizing more than ever health is wealth, right?
right,
Interacting with the sun, the
right,
trees, waterways, not only getting peace of mind, but you're getting vitamins you would not otherwise get. And you're getting your body is receiving frequencies you would not otherwise get if you were inside,
right,
right?
right,
And that is so necessary now where you're dealing with an immune system compromising threat,
right,
right? That not only is hitting your immune system, but the entire shift in society is hitting you here. So what better way to combat something that already is attacking you by like physically, by keeping
Mm-hmm.
your mental of a certain acuity, right? So that was
Right.
awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Where can we get in touch with you?
Yes. So directly, if you want to contact me, my information is there. But my email address is essentially is my first name, Tanasia, TANASIA .Swift, SWIFT @gmail.com. You can reach out if you're interested in either volunteer opportunities, getting near the water. I also have a new group that I'm forming in New York City called Water Women NYC, in order to
Mm,
bring people and women to the water and experience the water, making it, an everyday thing in New York City. My Instagram, so that's Earth Asia 524, Facebook, Tanasia Swift. And if you're interested in learning about the Billion Oyster Project, which is the organization nonprofit that I work for, you can also visit our website at billionoysterproject.org.
mm. Y'all heard it here first. And before we close, we got some insights on our next guest. We go like we said, we gotta keep giving y'all that heat, man. This is the STEM file. We the voice of STEM talent in Black culture. We can get y'all heat every week. Okay. So next week, right? Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, not next week. This coming Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have one of Brother Tariq's esteemed close mentors. We have Dr. Uzo Ba. That's UZOMBA. He's an MD PhD in endocrinology with a focus on diabetes. I'm gonna tell y'all this right now. If y'all have not seen a show where we talk about the biological sciences and Tariq is on, please get on. Bro goes in on a bunch of stuff that I know nothing about. Okay, okay. So the same way I bring the energy when it comes to material science or just engineering in general, Tariq brings that same energy and more when it comes to the biological sciences. Dr. Uzo Mba, MD, PhD, endocrinology with a focus on diabetes. Until next time, family, peace, love. The STEM Files, your brilliant engineer, Tariq Cardiac, Tanasia Swift.
Base.